Well, hello, everyone. I have now been at ThoughtSpot for a little over 2 months, but prior to that, I was at Google and I ran the global user growth team and analytics teams there, focusing on how to grow both the wide variety of consumer apps as well as the enterprise apps they have. The ones I spent personally the most time on were Google Ads and Google Cloud. And then before that, I focused as one of the earlier members of Facebook's growth team as well. And one of the things I'm super excited about, and one of the reasons I wanted to join ThoughtSpot was I think there's a huge opportunity to apply a lot of all of that learning into what we're doing here. And the notion that we are building a solution for non-analysts so that anyone can use it, not just analysts, means that we want to make sure we have these growth techniques built in. Growth is really about how do you get more users more engaged. And our success is going to be defined by the number of users that we can get engaged, because we're on a subscription service. If they're not engaged, then they're not going to resubscribe at the end of whatever their current subscription length is. So what I wanted to go over today, that a core part of thinking about growth is understanding some of the core principles and the mindset that goes behind it. And it's a fair bit different from how products are traditionally built. And I want to differentiate between there's core product and then there's product growth. You need to do both. What we've been doing really well historically is what I would call core product, which is how do you get more value into the product? How do you build things and deliver products and features that users can find really useful? You obviously have to do that. You have to keep doing that. Where product growth comes in and user growth, which comes from that, where that comes in is, okay, great, you've got all these capabilities in the product, but that doesn't mean that the value that they can deliver is actually being delivered. And so that's where growth comes in. It's about taking the value that's already in the product and how do you unlock it? And how do you get more people to engage with it and see the value? We've already done all the hard work of building the capability. How do we now unlock it and get as many people as possible, both within a specific customer and across customers, to use all of those things and really become engaged and build habits that this is part of their daily or weekly workflow. So the way this is approached is different than the way you approach core product development. Core product development is about having a vision for the product and understanding what the market needs and then building those capabilities. And I'm sure there are ways that we can improve on that, but overall we do that pretty well. What I want to talk about is, so how do you do the product growth part of it? And I'll just refer to that as growth as just a shorthand. Whereas the core product is about having this vision and having an idea about building out this roadmap, product growth is really much more data-driven. And what it really boils down to, and this is the process here really in 3 simple steps, it's a very process-driven, very structured approach to what you're doing in the product. So the first thing that you want to think about is really what it is about is taking the scientific method, which we all learned in whatever grade that was in sometime in elementary school. And it's about applying that approach to moving a metric. And my, I'm sure, pretty shaky and inaccurate recollection of the scientific method overall was the first thing you do is gather a lot of data. And then the second thing you do in the scientific method is come up with a hypothesis. If you're trying to understand some scientific phenomenon, you gather data on it, you come up with a hypothesis to explain it, and then the next thing you do is run experiments to see if your hypothesis was right. Generally, you're not going to be right the first time, so then you adjust your hypothesis and you try again. That's exactly what we do when we're talking about product growth. Instead of trying to understand some particular physical phenomenon or scientific phenomenon, what we're trying to do is move a metric that we care about, like how many people visit a pin board in a week, or the frequency with which people come back to the product, the different users within a customer, and how many different queries they run, and are they running Sage queries, or are they themselves, or are they just going to pin boards? There's a lot of metrics that we care about. And so the first thing we do in the growth process is we find a metric that we feel is really important, and that we feel we're not doing as well as we'd like to. And the first thing we do is do a lot of analysis to understand what are the things that move that metric. So we're looking at that we can figure out historically, like, are we seeing correlations between people who do a set of activities and pinboard viewers? Are we seeing different types of users that we can categorize based on behaviors overall? Or can we infer what their needs are? Whatever information we can gather, the goal is to understand what we think from whatever data we have. And if there's almost no data, then you go on whatever you can scrounge together, whether it's gut instinct or data that may not be directly relevant, but could be a proxy for what you're doing. Once you have some understanding that this is in fact an issue that you want to work on, and what affects that issue, then the next thing is, okay, well, we realize that one great way that seems to be working to get people to view pin boards is if people share these pin boards. That really does, we see in the data that drives a lot of usage of a pin board. But now the question is, how can we get people to share more than they currently are? So now we're on the second stage, which is we understand a couple things. We've identified one lever, which is sharing, if we want to get people to view more pin boards. Now we're on to generating a hypothesis of what can we do in the product to promote sharing more? What do we think will work? And let's say, for example, we want to have a sharing button that is highlighted as one of the key tabs, for example. I'm just making that up. It can be whatever you want. Some change to the product that makes sharing more prominent. It might be one of the ideas. And then we run an experiment where optimally, and we can't always do this, but we'd like to whenever we can, we have a holdout group where they have the old share experience, and we have a test group where we randomly pick some people there and put them in the test group. And then we run that experiment to see, does it actually drive more people to share? And does that, in fact, then get more people to focus on coming back to pin boards? Now, just like in the scientific method, where usually your first idea doesn't work, that's true here as well. And one of the things I see where it's kind of a fail state when people try to do this is they say, we tried the idea, it didn't work. And then they give up and move on. Or you'll ask them about something and they'll say, yeah, we tried it a year ago and it didn't do anything. If it does actually move the metric you care about on your first try, I would just consider yourself lucky. It generally doesn't. Most of these experiments don't work the first time. You're learning. So it is absolutely critical to this process to iterate and say, well, okay, it didn't work. What did we learn though? What data did we collect? Change our hypothesis. Let's try something else and try again. And you keep going until either you move the metric or you're pretty much out of ideas and you're like, well, we don't know how to move it, so let's move on to something else. So really just think about what this is it's not about launching new features. It's about making sure the features that we've already launched land well and that they deliver value. And the way we do that is by applying this scientific method. The second principle that I think is really important is to focus on, when you're talking about growth, to get everyone focused, it's a strong best practice to come up with a single North Star metric, which is, how are we measuring growth? How do we define success? Like, okay, if we build this, we change this feature, we tweak it, we optimize it, how do we know we did something good? And just to say, well, we'll launch it and look at all the different results, you'll find that some metrics go up and some go down. And almost every time you'll find at least one metric somewhere that went up as a result. But it's kind of cheating to say, well, here, that went up, so that was a success. You have to think about, what are we going to measure our own success by? And if we make that metric move, great, that was a success. If we didn't, it wasn't a success. So there's a fairly straightforward process about good ways of picking North Star metrics. You want to have one. Doesn't mean you only care about that thing, but it means that's the thing you're going to actively focus on moving, at least for a quarter or two. And you want to pick something so that it reflects changes that you make anywhere throughout the process, anywhere throughout the onboarding process, the engagement process, anywhere in the product. So whether it's the first few steps, if we can make that better, then that should move this North Star metric if we've chosen a good one, or if we improve engagement, or if we make a part of the product easier, or whatever it may be. You want to make sure that the North Star metric is something that when you make those improvements across the product, it'll move that. And the one that we are most likely looking at right now, we have been using weekly active users. We think we want to go a little more granular, and we're going to look at weekly user sessions, where a session is a fixed period of time when they come into our product and use it. And if we see a period of roughly 15 minutes of inactivity, we'll consider that the end of a session. And if they come back later, that's another session. So, and what we find when we do this is if you have a metric like that, it becomes a great proxy for revenue as well. Because if that metric goes up, you want to make sure it's a metric that correlates with revenue. And for us, that's true. If we see more sessions and more users, then we get better customer retention, which correlates with our revenue coming from those customers. Then you want something that's a really simple thing to get your head around, not some complex formula of number of pin boards they viewed and number of answers they created and the number of times they started a session and so on. You want something that's real simple to just say, look, it's sessions, or it's active users, where active just means they were in the product, or something like that. The simpler it is, the easier it is for everyone to get their head around. So that's the second thing. How do you define what growth is about? The third thing, and this is counter to what a lot of people think about, is you want to focus on the retention of your users. This is true within a company as well as across companies, meaning our customers. We want to make sure that we're retaining the users that we're bringing in a particular customer, as well as driving retention of the customer overall. And on the right here, I have a retention curve. And generally, the way to read this is you're looking at the number of people who started on a particular day, and we'll call that time zero. That's the complete left part of that graph there. And you're looking at the people who started on a particular day. So let's say we look at the people everyone who their first experience with the product was February 1st. So that's a cohort of the people who started using our product that day. And that cohort never changes. It's that same group of people. So by definition, on that first day, 100% of the cohort shows up, because that's how they got into the cohort. And then all you do is every day afterwards, you just count how many people from that cohort showed up on day 2, how many showed up on day 3. It doesn't matter if they showed up on day 2, as long as they showed up on day 3, we count them. And you just go out over time, and you look at what does that curve look like. And in almost every product, whether it's consumer or enterprise, you see something that looks at least like the first part of this curve here, where you see a steep decline early on. And we see that too in our own product, where you see you'll onboard 100 people in a particular week, and at least half of them, depends on the customer, but at least half of them don't come back the next week. And that's an issue. We'd like to do better than that. But rather than focus just on that initial loss, really what you want to focus first and foremost is, are you retaining really any of these users? And if that's true, then your curve over time will look like the one shown here, where it starts to flatten out. And in our case, given the frequency with which people should be using our product, within about a month to certainly no more than 2 months, if we see the curve is pretty flat, we're in pretty good shape. And I'm not sure that we have great visibility into all this yet, but I've seen a bunch of our curves. I think they look okay. I'm sure there's room to improve. But what you really care about is the shape of the curve. Once you have that, that means you have at least found a group of users who are finding this valuable. The next thing then is to figure out how to reduce the initial drop. But if it's not flat at all, then forget everything. It means you're bringing in users, and pretty soon every cohort becomes vacant. You have nobody left. And unless you keep bringing in new cohorts of users at a particular customer, you're pretty soon going to have no one using it. So you want to make sure the very, very first thing is have it flatten. Where it flattens is much less important. That really is much more a factor of how you're defining whether someone was active that day or not. We'll move that up or down. But get it flat and then focus on how do we move it up? What is it about those users who are staying that they're doing that people who don't stay aren't doing? And can we get more people to do that, have those same kind of experiences? Or maybe they're looking for things in the product that we don't yet have. So maybe we need to add that. Whatever it is, that there is a normal attraction to focusing on acquisition initially. But what we really want to do is focus on getting users retained. Start with a small number of users, make sure that we understand how to retain them, and then bring in other users at a particular customer. If we bring on tons of users and don't know how to keep them, then we just keep losing them. So it's counterintuitive for many, but that's a really good growth principle for all products. So for ThoughtSpot, when we're talking about retention, really as a great proxy for that, we look at user engagement, which is just how frequently do they use the product? Because user engagement is a leading indicator and a very, very strong one for user retention. People who use it more obviously tend to stay around longer in the product. And then user retention at the individual user level is a very good proxy for customer retention. If we've got a lot of people using it, we're going to keep the customer. If we have no one using it, they're going to not renew their contract. So the things that you want to do for user engagement for B2B businesses is we want to do everything we can in the product to form habits around these use cases. So they're using it for particular things. You want to make sure that we do whatever we can to form some habits, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a little bit. Also, we want to highlight to them in the product when they're using it new use cases. So maybe they're not using monitoring capabilities. So we want to introduce new features, and once they're using those, then form habits around using those. So that becomes a core part of their workflow because they're getting value out of it. And we also want to do things like make sure they understand the value they're getting from it. Like, okay, if you build a pin board, you may not, as an analyst, you may not know how many people are viewing it. But the more you can say, hey, here's how many people viewed it, and here's activity that's happened around it, the more you can do that, the more the analyst, I'm using that as one example here, who built that pin board, feels like, great, this is working. I'm getting value out of this because I'm building stuff that's actually getting used versus me just wasting my time. So some examples of how we can help build habits. Here's one from Google Ads, and we found a correlation between ad creation and these things called extensions, which you can see here, these things underneath an ad. This is an ad with extensions. This is an ad without. It's just a few links underneath the ad. It doesn't cost you any more to do. And we find that customers of, we were finding that customers of Google Ads who did this saw higher ROI. And that's great for them, and it was great for Google. So they wanted people, a lot of people to do it. But they weren't getting a ton of adoption because what you had to do here is create your ad, and then you had to click on this extensions tab. If you see at the top in the middle, you had to click on a separate extension tab to define your extensions. We just made a simple change to the UI where we got rid of that tab and just put the extension tab, as it were, beneath the part about creating the ad in the first place. So it just became part of the same flow. And you can see the numbers on the right, that it almost tripled the number of customers who were using, number of advertisers who were using extensions. So again, it doesn't cost them any more, but it does improve their ROI. So because it improves their ROI, they stay around more as advertisers and they spend more. So it became a very meaningful impact to Google overall in terms of advertising revenue. And here's just one other example, which you can do outside the product. It doesn't all have to be inside the product. This is, I was talking about value awareness. This is Google Ads again, where you create these ads and you can go into the system to find out how many people saw your ads. But it turns out it's a lot better if you can push that information to the advertiser. And these were emails that we sent out to people. And we were looking at quarterly retention rate, or 13-week retention rate. And we saw an 11% increase in the number of advertisers who were still spending advertising dollars after 13 weeks, just by proactively sending them information about, here are some of the results you're getting. So that's what I want to talk about in terms of increasing retention and the ways you can do this. So those are the first three principles. We have a few more. The next principle is getting the first mile right. We all spend a lot of time making sure that the way the product works is elegant, and everything once you're in the product is nicely designed and so on. And we tend to spend a lot less time on the onboarding experience, because the purpose of that is really just to get you into the product. It turns out, largely because of that retention chart I showed before, where most companies, including ThoughtSpot, lose the vast majority of their users in the first week or two. You want to make sure that that first mile, that first week or two, the experience there is really, really good. So here's an example. This is one of the only ones that I use in this presentation that's a consumer example, but I thought it was a good example. We've all seen this, and it does apply to us too, because we've considered doing things like this in our own app. This is for Google Drive, and this is from a few years ago. This was the onboarding process, where it was really just marketing that focused on, here's the great things about this product. You can save everything, and then you'd swipe to the left, and you get this access everywhere, and you swipe again, and then you get share with everyone. And what we were seeing there, and everyone thought that that was a best practice, because you've all seen it in so many of the apps you use. But what we found is that even though it was only 3 slides, 70% saw this and didn't go past that 3rd slide. So they abandoned this flow, if you will, before even getting to the actual home screen. And then, even worse, when we dug a little deeper, of the 30% that did finish, only 1 out of 4 of the 30% who did finish even remembered going through this. So it added no value pretty much to anyone, and it was a blocker for people. So we just changed it by simply removing that. In this case, we found that just removing it and getting people to the home screen and getting them into the action of what they're actually supposed to do. We saw that people who uploaded at least 1 file in their first week were significantly more likely to be retained as a user of Google Drive, because they get to experience the value of putting a file in the cloud that they can then share and view everywhere and access from any device. So we just got rid of that, and then this was the new first thing that opened up. And it's pretty clear what we're asking you to do here. Now 100% of the users would land directly on this home screen, and we saw a significant increase who would then tap that red button, because it's so highlighted, to upload a file. That's the way to get them to experience the value. And we saw significant increase in retention. Here's an example of getting the first mile right in Google Cloud. And this was the landing page that, depending on where you had entered the product from, what you had clicked on. This is a marketing example, and then I have a product example on the next slide. This is a marketing example where, depending on what you had searched for example, you would then get an ad for Google Cloud, click on it, and it used to bring you to the page you saw on the left. Everyone got the same page. Then someone said, well, yeah, but if you were looking for the Google Cloud platform, I was looking specifically for a compute engine, or someone was looking for BigQuery, they may, wouldn't it be better to kind of give them things more tailored? So we just made simple changes. You'll notice a theme here. Most of these changes are fairly simple to say, based on your search term, we're going to drop you into a different page to get you more information. And we saw an increase in adopting the first product. Google Cloud has tons and tons of different products that make up the whole platform. We saw a 16% increase in adoption. And we saw a 21% increase in accounts that spent at least $10, which was a threshold that was used quite frequently in Google Cloud. A fifth key premise here that's really important. As I mentioned, a lot of these things that we're doing, a lot of these growth experiments are not these massive efforts. They don't take a ton of resources. Really, the best way to focus on having consistent growth, rather than trying to bank on, we've got these 3 big ideas and we're going to put everything we've got into these huge ideas for new functionality. Well, given that most things don't work the first time you try them, there's a good likelihood that of those 3, either 0 or 1 of them may actually work all that well. We've all had big launches, been part of teams that have had big launches and the features didn't perform as expected. And there was a study by Harvard Business School, and they said that 80% of new feature launches don't live up to expectations. So given that, is it better to only focus on these big things that could be these great home runs, or to do lots of little things? The optimal answer is yes, you still need to do a few of these big home run things because those can be great, but because there's no guarantee that they'll work, you want to, instead of maybe doing 3 big things in some development cycle, do 2 big things and lots of little things. So here's an example of little things. This is from the bar that was at the top of the Google Cloud product when you were in the middle of your free trial. And it kept reminding you that, hey, you're using this product, but this little bar at the top would say, the first version, you can read it. It had dismiss or upgrade. And then the second bar, we just kept iterating. We used some behavioral science principles and so on, but just kept iterating on what we thought might work better. And this is a remarkable number that 35% of the accounts upgraded. And the thing that's doubly remarkable is you can frequently get, just by changing the wording and by changing someone's mindset about it, you can get a significant increase in people taking the action that you're recommending. And we, of course, track dismiss rates. There was no change in the number of people dismissing this thing that was always at the top of the screen until they clicked one of those 2 buttons. So really significant win here. And it took us about 6 iterations or so before we got something that performed this well. As I mentioned, iteration is a core part of this. But we knew that this was a critical part. This is a metric we wanted to move, the number of people that clicked on upgrade. So we really wanted to work on this, and we just kept applying those scientific method principles to this to figure out, what did we learn, what could we try, what are our hypotheses about what might work better, and eventually we got something that worked really well. A few more principles in terms of where growth is really focused. I talked about that core product is mostly about building new features and functionality that deliver new value and more value to users, and make the product so that it is available to a new set of users, like our Embrace product. So now people who are using Snowflake or any of these cloud data warehouses that we support, we can now sell to them as well. So that is a core focus for the core product team. But as I mentioned, really what growth is about is making sure that those features land. And one of the biggest ways to make sure that they land is to find those features that, for those who use them, we see a high correlation between those who use them and engagement with the product and retention as a user over a long amount of time. So what we really want to do is find out, once we've identified what those features are, how do we make sure that the people even know about these features? And we had lots of examples when I was at Google and lots of different products that I worked across, where we saw that people weren't even aware of many of these key features. They just didn't know. Like, I've got a couple examples here. First is just do something to raise awareness. And I don't mean necessarily highlighting a little call out in the screen, though that's certainly one way to do it. There are other ways that are kind of potentially more natural. So if just looking at this notion of increasing feature awareness, if you look at that first screenshot, we found that people who were doing what we had called local searches, searching for things in their neighborhood, would tend to come back and do it again and again. So it was a sticky kind of query. But a lot of people didn't know that you could find a pizzeria nearby or an ATM nearby. Also, this was done in India. That's why you can see the examples there. People weren't aware that you could get movie times. They didn't know that. So we wanted to highlight that. And they didn't know that you could get sports scores like cricket scores. They were going to different apps, but they didn't know that you could use Google search to get, in many cases, up to the minute scores. So we wanted to highlight this. So we did things like in the search box, as soon as you tapped in it on, in this case, it was an Android phone, this little menu would pop down, this little window would kind of scroll down and would say, try searching for these things. This was it to try, and it would scroll through and cycle through about a dozen different ones. And we would only pick the ones that the user had never done before. If they'd searched for scores before, we wouldn't show them try searching for cricket scores. We'd pick some of the other ones. So that worked really well. Another thing to do about increasing discoverability is just make it easier to get to that feature. We've got some great IQ stuff in our own product. Like you can take 2 points on a line graph and highlight 2 different points and ask our engines to figure out what was the reason for the increase or decrease. You can do that, and it's in there, but it's a bit hard to get to. It's hard to find. So how do you make things like this easier to use or easier to find? So here's an example again with Google search, where we found that people who were looking for weather were doing it frequently. That's something you may want to do essentially every day. And so there was high engagement with that, but it was there was friction because you had to type in WEATHER. So what we ended up doing is adding these little touch targets, these tap targets beneath the search box to just make it easier to get to weather, easier to get to sports, or easier to get to entertainment. And the third point is trying to promote features in context, trying to promote something where someone is likely to want to use that feature at that time. So an example here from Google Maps, where we had introduced a feature called Pit Stop, which is you could say, I'm at point A and I want to go to point B, navigate to point B, but you want rest stops and you want restaurants along the way because it's going to be a long drive. When we initially launched this feature, we did the typical, hey, there's a splash screen that you see when you first open the app that says, hey, new release, there's this new feature, try it. Very little adoption of the feature based on that, because who knows what people were in the app for. If they weren't going to go on a long drive somewhere that they needed navigation instructions for, they're not going to use it at that time, and then they're going to forget about it. So instead, we changed it to, as soon as you were saying, I need directions to get from point A to point B, and we had a threshold after a while of, I think it had to be ultimately 45 minutes or more was the estimated drive time. We would say, hey, we'd pop up this thing, would you like to add a pit stop? We have this functionality. And we saw about 6 times the number of users use the feature after we introduced it in context when they might be likely to actually want to use that feature. So here are some examples of discovery of existing features. This is from Google Cloud. They had documentation, and you could click on a link and get documentation, but it wasn't within the user flows themselves, and people weren't using it that much. And also, we were realizing that we were missing an opportunity to get people to realize there are other products they could also use in the current flow that they're in that Google Cloud offered that they weren't currently using. So we built into the product itself this Learn panel, which would pop up on the screen itself. You know, when you would click help, or you could say, you know, get step-by-step instructions. And there are some examples of these Learn panels. So it would give you, they would pop up in context. So if you were working on spinning up a new virtual machine, it would pop up like, would you like step-by-step instructions and how to do that? And give you this Learn panel. And all we really did for the most part was reformat and repurpose a lot of the documentation that had already been written. But we also then added in, here are some different products you can use. If you're spinning up a VM, here's a product you can use to monitor that VM. that Google would sell. So we looked at the results on this, and they were, again, pretty significant. If they were using this, they were already using at least one product. Kind of by definition, they were in the product, in the platform already. So what we were looking for success here was, what was the adoption rate of a second product? And you can see on the right that we saw an 11% increase in accounts who were adopting a second product, because we were giving them suggested next actions and suggested next products that they could use. And one last thing here as well. This was a simple one that worked quite well. This was getting into the product and how you could navigate around the different parts of the product. But there was a hamburger menu in the upper left. It's a little hard to see on the left screen, so most people didn't really think of clicking on it. They'd immediately go to these little tiles and figure out which one they wanted to click on. So all we did was, for new users, we just automatically opened that navigation the first time they came in to let them know it was there. And we saw the usage of that menu then increase significantly. And using the same thing about how do we get them to a second and a third and a fourth product, we saw an 8% increase in second product adoption. Just by taking something that was already in the product, this menu, and helping people understand that it's there and where to find it. So the last two things I want to focus on, last two principles. One is focus on, again, this is kind of counterintuitive, but focus on your worst users, not your best. This is really hard for enterprise companies because your best customers are often the ones who are paying quite a bit, and you end up making sure that a lot of your engineering staff is focused on building the things that that customer needs. If you just want to objectively look at what's going on, though, the largest growth you're going to get is not from your users who are already using it heavily, but from your users who aren't using it much at all. So the example I gave about customers who are paying us a lot, shift your mindset to the actual users there within that customer. And if you want to ensure that that customer is going to continue paying a lot, yes, you might need to add some new features, but you want to get more and more and more users onto the system for them. Now, here's an engagement curve, and the way to read this is out of a 4-week period, 28 days, how many people used the product? This isn't ThoughtSpot here, it could be anything. 1 day out of that 28-day period, 2 days, all the way up to they used it every day, 28 out of 28 days. And you can see the shape that this curve is taking. Well, if I take the people who are using it 25 days a month, because they're the ones who use it a lot, and they're very active in the forums, and they put in a lot of requests, and I get them to use it 2 more days a month by building what they need, then I've gone from 25 to 27. That's roughly an 8% increase in usage overall for that group. And you can see that group, you know, the height of that bar. So it's on the smallish side relative to everything else. The other thing to realize is they're your heavy users. They're not going to churn out of the product. Now, you want to keep them happy, yes, but they're not going to be able to drive much growth for you. That was an 8% increase. Let's go to the other end. Somebody using the product 2 days out of that 4-week period. And I figure out why are they only using it 2 days and focus on how to get them more engaged. And I increase their usage by 2 days. So it's the same 2 days, but now instead of an 8% increase, I went from 2 to 4, that's a 100% increase. And the number of users is larger. So it gives me mathematically, it gives me a much larger increase in the number of users within that customer who are using my product every day. So often what you really want to focus on is how do we get the users who haven't made this a habit yet? Focus on getting them to the habit stage and moving them to the right. So it's take your worst users and push them to the right, and trying to take your best users and get them even more engaged. The payoff tends to be bigger if you focus on those who aren't yet engaged. And then finally, what I want to end with is, this one is really fascinating and kind of fun, and can go really deep here, but I'll just have a few slides on it. It's this notion of every what needs a why. And what we're really talking about here is user motivation. We know what we want the users to do. Like from the example I gave in one of the earlier slides, we would love to have them share pinboards more. That's what we want them to do, because we think that that's going to help their business more and help them get more value out of it and so on. So we want to encourage them to do that. They need a why. Why should they do that? How do we motivate them to do that? And it turns out that the motivation is almost entirely emotional, not logical. So if you say that here's the percentage increase you're going to get and so on, that doesn't land very well and is not all that good at changing behavior. The way psychologists have figured out that people make decisions is we first make the decision at an emotional level, then we use logic to support the decision we had made emotionally. So what it turns out is that people don't make logical, rational decisions. In fact, we make quite irrational decisions. And I'll give you an example about that, which kind of seems a little bit of a depressing scenario, because if they're making irrational decisions, then how are we supposed to get them to do the things that we're encouraging them to do? You know, that'll help them get more value. Well, the good news is that what I say in point 2 here is that they make irrational decisions, but they're highly predictable. In other words, we make the same bad decision over and over again. And those bad decisions are very predictable. So given that we know how people are going to behave, or we can have a good way of predicting it, we can incorporate that into making the product better and encouraging them to use best practices in ways that are going to land with them. That's where this whole field of behavioral science has really developed for all products, of how do you encourage people that explore different parts of the product in ways that align with how they make decisions whether or not to do things. So here's a quick example. This is a famous study that was done a couple decades ago. People at a car wash were randomly given one of 2 cards. And the first one said, okay, if you get 8 car washes, you get your 9th one for free. Great. And the second card, if you look closely, it says if you get 10 car washes, you get your 11th one for free. But before they handed it out to people, they punched the first 2 for them to say, it's your lucky day, here you go, we're gonna give you 2 free ones. So in actuality, these cards are now identical. In both cases, if you get 5 more washes, you'll get your next one for free. So then how do you explain this result? Almost twice as many, 78% more people completed the second card. And this experiment has been done many times in many different ways, and we get similar results each time. So it's completely irrational, but highly predictable. And it has to do with something that in behavioral science they refer to as goal gradient, which just means when you know what a process is, and here it is, your process is get 8 or 10 car washes, and you can see the progress you've made, the closer you are to finishing that process, the more motivated you get to finish it. So in the first case, you're 0% done. In the second case, you're already 20% done. So how do we apply that? Well, here's a case of how we applied it in Google Ads. This is the original before we applied anything. When you create an ad, what you were actually creating is what they call an ad group. You create multiple variations of a single ad, and that's called an ad group. Just different ways of wording the same kind of thing. And the data shows that if you create 3 or more of these ads, 3 or more variants, then the system that chooses which variant to show to particular users has more to work with. They can say, oh, this variant works better with this type of user, this demographic, and this second variant works better with this other one. So it works better to have more. Here we were saying very clearly, you can see I circled it in red, we recommend you create at least 3 ads. However, only a small fraction of new users, it was about 26%, created more than 1 ad, more than 1 variation of an ad. So that wasn't good for them, and then they're not getting good ROI, so that wasn't good for Google. So we just, using this goal gradient process of making it a process and showing them how far they have gotten in that process, we just changed the UI to be this. The red arrows are mine, I added those in. But now we said, okay, great. It's pretty clear here that you're supposed to put 3 in. And we even added in the ad number 1 of 3. Now, not shown here, there's a button that says submit. So you can stop anytime you want, but we gave you all these visual clues. This is basically your punch card, right? And you can see, wow, I've already done 1. I just have 2 more to go. And we saw an increase in 20% of the number of advertisers who had at least three or more of these ads. So, and we saw that they got better ROI because of this. They were creating 25% more ads overall. So they were winning and Google was winning. Again, a simple UI change, but very, very effective. And that's really all I wanted to cover. I wanted to leave the last 15 minutes or so if anyone has any questions. But those are some of the things that I and people I'm working with are going to be focusing on. You'll see lots more of those kinds of things. So thank you for being here. Thanks for giving me the opportunity to speak with you, and happy to answer any questions either now or if something comes up down the road at any point.
Cool. So thanks, Ken. Looks like we have some questions from the Q&A panel. I think you can see it.
No.
No, you can't? Okay. Oh, I can read it to you.
There we go. There we go. Sorry.
Okay, cool.
All right. I have one here. Hello, Snigdha. How are you doing? Question. Should I read off the question, or I'm sure everyone can see, but I'll read it anyway.
Yeah.
Okay. How does one efficiently analyze user engagement behavior for a B2B app that has so many components in it? Also, specifically, we have different personas of users, and one company could be more persona B heavily than persona A. How do you adjust your analysis to fit that? Yes, all of that is true. What you're trying to do in a North Star metric is figure out something that works for as broad a range of personas as possible. And I will add one caveat, which is there is no such thing as a perfect North Star metric. There's always trade-offs that you have to make. But it is far better to have a North Star metric than to not have one at all, because it gives you incredible focus. And you can all agree on what we're trying to do and how we're going to measure whether or not we did what we're trying to do. So if you look at something like weekly active users, that encompasses, well, if they're using search, or if they're using, Sage Search, if they're using pin boards or just going to answers, all of those get captured by, well, were they a weekly active user or not? Because we were measuring that initially, and we may still stay with that. As I mentioned, we may be changing it to sessions overall, but that just says, look, did they come to the app at all? We'll use that as a proxy for if they keep coming back to the app, then they're doing it because they're getting value. So there's a broad range of functionality, but we're going to just measure whether they're coming back. And because they can come back several times a day, we wanted to get a little more granular and say, well, can we slice that into sessions? Because if they're doing a lot of sessions a day, it matters a lot less what they're doing in those sessions. Let's just keep it simple, right? Some people are going to be doing more high-valued stuff. Some people are going to be doing more low-valued stuff. But assuming that those ratios stay somewhat stable over time, if we can just up the number of people using the app, then all personas, that can help all personas and so on. You will want to look and say, well, are the increases we're seeing only coming from one persona type? We may be alienating others, and that's what we call guardrails. You want to have some other metrics that you want to make sure aren't being harmed as you move this other one up. But that's generally how you do it. You try and pick something that applies to as many of these personas and as many in-app use cases as possible. And then question 2 was how to identify if the user is not using ThoughtSpot because 1, it's not easy to use, or because 2, it doesn't have the use case that interests our user yet. Well, there's usually no way to know these things factually because we can't read minds, but you run experiments to see. So if there's a user, and we can look at what their behaviors were they trying several times to do something and failing at it, or were they went in, they clicked around once or twice and then left and haven't come back. That gives us a signal. The other thing we can do is, if we're really not clear, we can say, well, let's see if we can make a particular aspect of it, like search, for example, can we make that easier? Do user studies and so on, try and make it easier, and then launch that and see, are we getting more people to be more engaged and more retained? And even if we don't see it in our first iteration, as I mentioned, you need to iterate a few times, and either we will see that, yes, we have gotten it to be easy enough now, or at least measurably easier, that we're seeing an increase in engagement, or we're still not seeing anything and we've iterated on this a handful of times. In that case, I would say, well, based on the data we have now, it looks like we may actually be missing features, and it's not about a usability of the existing features, it's about a lack of features. So I hope that answered your question. If there's anything else, let me know.
Yeah, so I know you talked about it a little bit, but how does the strategy differ for like enterprise versus consumer? So I know Google Cloud is a little bit more enterprise, that like general Google.
Yeah, and Google Ads
is,
and Google Cloud, which is actually where I spent my last 2 years at Google focusing on personally. My group focused on both enterprise and consumer, but I really found myself being really drawn to consumer. The strategies are more similar than different, because at the end of the day, it's a person in front of a device, whether it's their laptop or their phone. It's a person in front of their device, and you're trying to give them experiences that are valuable to them, and if so, they will continue to use it. Now, there are some things like when we looked at Gmail. Gmail was a little bit of a challenge for us, because you don't really want to think about engagement in terms of how many times they use it. We're not trying to get them to come back and send more emails. That doesn't really make sense. So those can be challenging. But products where people get value out of using it, you're looking at engagement as a proxy for value. If they're using it more, you make the assumption, and you can't know for sure that it's true, but you make the assumption that if they're using it and and they continue to use it, that they're getting some kind of value out of it, particularly if it's become a habit for them. So the main thing to focus on is, well, what are the key features and functionality that people are using in the app that correlate with them getting the most value, meaning correlate with them being the most engaged. So the strategies turn out to be quite similar.
Cool. So it looks like there's a couple more questions on the Q&A.
Should I read Utsav's here?
Yeah.
With the current deployment process, where new releases take a couple of months for customers to deploy, this is a stake through my heart, Utsav. What are some of the steps we will take in that area so we can speed up our experiments? Well, this was, for me, coming into this, I knew this was going to be a huge challenge. It's really hard to make a lot of progress on growth, where a key part of it is to come up with hypotheses and then test them and learn as quickly as possible what worked and what didn't, so you can iterate and do it again. So one of the things coming in that we were doing, which early on was going to be really helpful, was splitting out Blink, so we could have Blink being something that we could release far faster than the rest of the stack. And we could have multiple, Blink releases a month if we wanted. And since a lot of this work can be done just at the Blink level, certainly not all of it, but a lot of it can be done at the Blink level, that would help us iterate on at least some subset of the experiments we wanted to do. Then there was the whole initiative of, that we wanted to, speed was our very first kind of core metric that we wanted to look at, which is ship fast, deploy faster. We were going to get from multiple months down to maybe, 2 months or something like that, which is, hey, if I can do 6 iterations a year versus 3, that's twice as good. And then most recently, which I'm super excited about, I'm definitely biased because, growth benefits from this kind of inordinately, which is great. The SaaS version of this. With SaaS, yes, you don't want to upgrade every day, because that can be a little disruptive. But, you look at releases like Salesforce.com, they do major releases many times a year and minor releases really frequently. Even things like Google Ads, which, there are people who live in that, we would usually have almost a release a day that was just minor tweaks and fixes, and then a major release every few months. So it helps a ton once we can do SaaS. Then we're really, game on. Then we can do things quickly. See, Priyanka, how do you use this to make sure we spice up things for the, there we go, to spice up things for the user to nudge them to explore more offerings? Well, I was talking about feature awareness, and there's a whole lot more we can talk about at some other point for how to raise feature awareness. But generally, they're referred to as nudges, right? There are things I can do in the product I can create more entry points. We talked about that a little bit, just making it easier to find the particular feature itself. You can have call outs using in-app messaging. You want to do them in context. So at the time when there's a feature that they want to use, making sure that, when there's a time when there's a feature that would make sense for them to use, but they don't know about it, but they would likely want to use it if they knew about it, that's a good time to introduce it to them. Those are the kinds of things that you can do. Then there's also nudges you can do outside. There's push notifications, and there's emails. And yes, I said emails, but emails actually can work, and they're a good way to convey. Things like pin boards work a hell of a lot better, where you can show something visually in an email than nudges, where you have limited kind of visual flexibility there. But there's a ton we can do there. Srikanth said, awesome presentation, eye-opening. Thank you, Srikanth. I'm very flattered. And Utsav said, is CDN for Colossum and Sage on the roadmap? Last I heard it was. Things are changing very quickly with the SaaSathon and so on, but I haven't heard any different. I spoke to Ashish last week and it's still on, so I'm quite excited about that. And Srikanth just has a comment here. I think the thing we're learning that is dynamic in context. I think that the learn that is dynamic in context and more prominent, like in the example given, will be very useful for us. Yes, I agree. All right, we are, I think I just finished the last question and it is 2:59. So somehow we managed to fit that all in 1 hour. Thank you all again. I'm super easy to find. Would love to have any of you reach out to me directly. Or if there's another topic you'd like to hear about, I'm happy to do another one of these. And I hope you found it useful. Thanks all.
Great. Thanks, Ken. Cool.